And I recognize the gentleman from Alabama for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I oppose this legislation for several reasons. Start with the Constitution. Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution requires that all drawdowns of the general fund of the Treasury must go through the appropriation process. However, this bill circumvents the appropriations process by sending funds directly from the general fund of the Treasury to the Housing Trust Fund, and that's $6.2 billion. According to the minority staff on the Senate Committee on Budget, the federal government has pledged more than $9.7 trillion to address our economic credit crisis, including billions for foreclosure mitigation initiatives. For instance, the Treasury has committed $75 billion for loan modification and foreclosure prevention. Instead of using the TARP dividends to offset these obligations, Chairman Frank's bill spends them. It also increases the federal debt. Any new federal commitment would come on top of our existing $10.9 trillion national debt and an estimated 2009 budget deficit of $1.8 trillion, despite the fact that dividend provisions in TARP were intended to make taxpayers whole from any bailout committed. This bill would obviously flies in the face of that commitment. Today, soaring deficits are the biggest threat to financial stability, economic recovery, and job growth. Vice President Biden acknowledged that the administration had misread the economy. But the solution to the administration is more deficit spending, including potentially another multi-billion-dollar government stimulus, a new $1.5 trillion government-run health care plan, and now the chairman's new legislation to divert $6.2 billion from TARP to finance an affordable housing trust fund. Most disturbingly, this legislation transfers $1.5 billion to the Neighborhood Stabilization Program, which could be accessed by ACORN, a community group notorious for its efforts to commit voter fraud. Ironically, this approach also undermines the flexibility that Treasury Secretary Geithner indicated is necessary for the Treasurer to carry out TARP's authorized legislation. In a June 30th letter just last week, Secretary Geithner said, "We believe it's critical that the Treasury maintain full flexibility to strengthen our financial system, promote the flow of credit, and permit a rapid response to unforeseen economic threats." Yet here we consider legislation that undermines that flexibility. Mr. Chairman, one of the best things we can do to stabilize the credit markets and promote long-term economic growth is to restore fiscal discipline and stop the reckless government spending. Just this week, Morgan Stanley's chief economist characterized our trillion-dollar-a-year deficits as America's fiscal train wreck and offered this dire warning: soaring debt will force up real interest rates, reducing credit and productivity and boosting debt service. Not only will these factors steadily lower our standard of living, but they imperil our economic and financial stability. This bill adds $6.2 billion to that deficit. As institutions begin to pay back their TARP assistance, we need to end the bailouts and return that money to the taxpayers, thereby reducing the deficit. Republican members of the committee, including the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Hensarling, and the gentleman from California, Mr. McCarthy, have introduced legislation to do that. I urge the members of this committee to support that legislation, not this legislation. $6.2 billion added to the deficit. I'm very interested in hearing the witnesses' perspective on this legislation. Thank you, Chairman, and yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman